right, let's see if this works now. All right. So, once again, I live in San Francisco, but I was born in Los Angeles. That is my mother, and that is her real hair. And growing up in LA in the 1970s, I watched a lot of TV. And like all little boys growing up anywhere, I was really fixated by all forms of transportation. But I was particularly fixated by the cars that I saw so much of watching TV growing up in the 70s. And those TV commercials, which advertisers spent billions and billions of dollars on, convinced me of a couple of key things. Among them, and most importantly, that someday owning my own car would bring me power and freedom and, adventure and social status, and of course someday sex, right? Owning my own car was going to transform me in this amazing way. And as I got older, my first job was actually working at Disneyland in Southern California. And the only ride at Disneyland that is unchanged since opening day in 1955 is the Autopia ride, right? The Autopia ride, which was built in advance of the interstate freeway system, right? To convince people of the glory of, what the interstate freeway system is going to be. And so even today, in 2015, Americans drive through horrible traffic congestion to get to Disneyland. They park in this enormous parking lot. They stand in line for the privilege of being in a small version of the thing that they just arrived in, stuck in traffic congestion, because somehow we still find this completely compelling and interesting as Americans. We're really, really odd in our attitude about the automobile. And there's no surprise that this is the case. The thinking about the car really started back in the 1930s. And I highly encourage you to Google, just go to YouTube and search for World's Fair Futurama. And there are videos, not from the 1933 World's Fair, but the 39 and 64 World's Fair Futurama exhibits, an industrial exhibit sponsored by General Motors. And particularly in the 39 World's Fair, this was the most visited industrial exhibition in the history of the world. About a third of Americans showed up during the during the Depression, really, in 1933, to see this vision of the city of the future. A vision of the city of the future in which there would be a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. And that owning a car would not only deliver us freedom, autonomy, social status, and sex, but would deliver us this unique kind of economic and social mobility. And indeed, I would argue that the interstate freeway system that was inspired by these World's Fairs exhibition was potentially the wisest, the most powerful investment this country ever made. It transformed this vast nation and united us into one country and made it possible not only to get goods to market from obscure corners of the country, but it made possible a kind of radical self-reinvention. You could go anywhere and become anyone thanks to the freedom of mobility offered by the private automobile. An amazing, amazing invention. And we have lavished an immense amount of money on this vision of the city of the future, and indeed it has delivered spectacular dividends at the large scale. But it's created some problems at the smaller scale, and of course it's also made it really frustrating to us when this promise of unlimited mobility is constrained by the reality of our everyday experience driving on these roads and being stuck in horrific traffic congestion. It's really, really awful. And so most of us as Americans feel cheated. We were promised this, Jetsons vision of the city of the future of unlimited mobility, and what was delivered was in fact this congested, chaotic mess. And so we demand that something must be done. Of course, not thinking through the law of unintended consequences. And this is really the fundamental flaw of my entire industry, is really we are object thinkers rather than systems thinkers. So I own a small business. We're pretty successful. And one might think that if I, beat my employees, that I could get more productivity out of them, right? Beat them, make them work harder, all the profits go into my pocket. Awesome. In reality, running a small business is a slightly more complex system than that. If I beat my employees, maybe I can get an hour's worth of additional productivity out of them, but they would quickly leave, right? And I would end up having a not very profitable business at all. Because in fact, running a small business is a complex system. Every action in business has a whole cascading set of counteractions. If I charge too much for my billing rates, I also don't make more money. I need to find the right number of employees, treat them the right way, figure out exactly what the right billing rate is, figure out who my clients are, who my competition is, and be juggling all of these factors all at the same time. Now, running a transportation system is a lot more complicated than running a small business. And yet we treat it as if it were relatively simple, and we don't think through the consequences of the decisions and investment strategies that we're making. Now, one field that I really like paying attention to, because they love data more than we do in transportation, and more importantly, they actually go back and measure the after effect of every time they make an investment, and that is the medical industry. One of the areas of data that the medical industry has been collecting since about 1985 is obesity rates in the United States. And they've been sort of graphing this at the state level and more recently at the sort of neighborhood level, which is even more intriguing. But we can observe as time goes on the trends of obesity rates in the United States, where every few years they've got to change the scale because big chunks of the United States in 1994, over 15% of adults are clinically obese. In 97, we changed the scale again. In 2001, over 25% of adults in Mississippi are clinically obese. And in 2006, we changed the scale again. And in 2009, even here in Louisiana, over 30% of adults clinically obese. Now, correlation is not the same as causation. There are many factors contributing to the rapid increase in obesity rates in the United States. One of them, of course, very much having to do with diet. But something that we've realized in there was a famous article about why French women don't get fat, despite the incredibly rich, wonderful diet that one enjoys in Paris. One of the things that the researchers have observed is a very strong correlation, particularly at the neighborhood level, matching rising obesity rates with rates of walking. Cities that are not designed for walking, cities where you have to get in your car in order to drive to the gym and stand on a miserable treadmill, right? These are places that are not only making us fat, but making us extraordinarily unhealthy. At the same time, there are other interesting impacts, relationships between transportation and public health. In fact, my friends who work as physicians regularly complain to me that we in the transportation industry have far more control over public health outcomes than the entire medical profession does. The medical profession, their job is to clean up the mess after the mess has been created. Our job in transportation is, in fact, to keep people healthy, right? To make walking, to make 10,000 steps a part of our daily life. But beyond just the health of our physical bodies, transportation has a large bearing on our mental health and our happiness. This is a chemical here called oxytocin. It is a neuropeptide. It's produced in the brain under very limited circumstances, and it is effectively the biological basis of trust. It is the chemical that makes us feel socially bonded and that if I scratch your back, you'll at some point scratch my back, and some point in the future, we won't worry about that right now. It's all going to be good. So oxytocin is produced for very specific reasons. It is produced when we gaze longingly into the eyes of someone we love. It is produced most powerfully for obvious reasons during breastfeeding and orgasm. But bizarrely, it is also produced when we exercise outdoors. Scientists don't understand why the same level of exercise indoors does not release oxytocin to the degree that it does when we exercise out of doors. And in fact, we've all experienced this. Think of a time when you were having a horrible argument with your significant other. You're saying things that you regret. You're worked up, you're tight, you're angry, very, very frustrating, and finally you decide, I've had enough, and you walk outside, and you go for a brisk walk, or you go for a jog, or a bike ride. And 20 minutes later, oftentimes as little as 5 or 10 minutes later, your entire worldview changes. Right? We've all experienced this. This is not the world changing. This is not your spouse changing. This is your brain chemistry changing. This is your brain chemistry on an array of chemicals, the endorphins and serotonins, but also, quite interestingly, oxytocin, which allows you to trust again. At the same time, there's another array of chemicals that your brain releases when you're trapped in your car in horrible traffic congestion. Now, how many of you will admit to having said things out loud behind the wheel, stuck in congestion, that you would never said under any other circumstances? How many of you would admit to have actually threatened the lives of your loved ones in your own car, let alone the strangers who are, cutting you off, right? Like, we do outrageously dangerous, socially irresponsible things trapped behind the wheel of a car, and it is because of a very specific set of reasons. Our brains are designed to send and receive an enormous number of social signals. So we're social primates. We get a lot of information from people around us. You can walk down a really, really crowded sidewalk and not bump into people, even though you don't have turn signals on your belt, right? And even if you do bump into somebody, you don't have to turn around and issue a formal apology. There's 1,000 subtle gestures, shrug of the shoulders, putting up the hands, just, ducking your head, that issues the apology to say, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, and all is forgiven and it's forgotten about. Now in a car, when you're driving at 65 miles an hour, surrounded by steel and glass, and somebody cuts you off, right? A couple things happen. Firstly, your social status is threatened because doesn't this person know who you are? Hey. And at the same time, the threat mechanism is triggered in the brain as well. Now, you get a little upset, you say, hey buddy, what do you think you're doing? And of course, this person can't hear you. This person may not even know that he's just cut you off. And now, this person has not responded to your demand for a response. Everything in your brain is triggered to escalate the situation until you get satisfaction, right? The continued lack of social response makes your brain get even crazier and triggers the fight or flight response in the brain. So, what happens? A whole cascade of chemicals. All of your muscles tighten, right? Blood goes to the extremity. Most importantly, the prefrontal cortex of the brain gets disconnected. Literally disconnected from the rest of the brain. Because when you're being chased by a saber-toothed tiger, the last thing you want to do is to think about, well, should I turn around and negotiate with the tiger? Maybe if I gave it a piece of meat? No. If you start thinking, you're dead. In a car, the same thing happens. Your ability to think through the consequences of your actions, which is, one of the primary functions of this part of the brain, no longer exists. You go into reaction mode and you do stupid things. This is not you becoming stupid. This is your brain having a set of mechanisms that was very effective, on the savannah in, Africa a couple million years ago, not very effective in the car. Now, if you have these set of reactions that are triggered every day because you're stuck in this horrible traffic congestion, it actually creates permanent changes in your brain. Permanent changes that make you angrier, less trustful, less capable of thinking through the consequences of your actions. And in fact, I would argue that a large part of the state of current federal American politics are largely due to the fact that we have designed our cities to force people to be stuck in this situation every day, and it has changed their brain chemistry. But that's a whole other lecture. So, we wonder why all of our design requirements, our transportation performance metrics, our funding formulas, every part of the DNA of our cities and our transportation systems require that new communities be designed like this, because Americans say they, want the single-family home and the three-car garage in the backyard, but they don't like the consequences that come with it. And why our street design code and our parking requirements and our complete street skylines, like, look, this is a complete street. There's, it meets the level of service requirements. There's a mixed-use community. There's sidewalks. There's landscaping. It met the minimum parking requirement, right? Right? This is a perfect manifestation of exactly what every code in every city in America requires for a complete mixed-use walkable community. And look, indeed, there's even a pedestrian. This is the highest manifestation of the success of our codes and regulations. And so is it any wonder that none of our citizens trust the ability of government to deliver on its promise, when this promise of walkable, mixed-use, transit-oriented communities and the rules and regulations that govern our cities directly contradict each other? I have never been a place in the United States where if the favorite building or neighborhood or street burned down, I have never been a place where it would be legal to replace that favorite part of the city. In every city in the country, it is in fact illegal to build what we say we want in our communities. So, how do we fix this? 10 points, and I'll try to speed it up a little bit here. Firstly, we need to recognize that mobility is not an end in itself, right? Simply allowing people to move around in circles accomplishes nothing. Transportation is an investment strategy. It is an investment strategy in order to achieve, whatever your local goals are. And in fact, transportation is far better seen as a branch of economics than it is as a branch of civil engineering. What we do in transportation is create value for something else. In fact, and then our task in a market-based economy is to find that equilibrium point between supply and demand. And as Don Chu points out for parking, the right price for parking is always the lowest price that provides the right amount of availability. The right price for parking is the lowest price that makes sure that people can find a space. So the same is true in transportation. However, for mobility, we have chosen not to use the market to balance supply and demand in transportation. So instead, people pay with their money. We ask people to pay with their time. So we do not charge money for mobility. We ask people to pay with their time instead. And, one could argue that that is rational. One could also argue that it is extraordinarily wasteful, particularly when you consider typical transportation patterns. So this is time across the bottom. This is sort of typical traffic flow, inbound on a big arterial. And you'll notice the big spike in the morning as people are heading to work and to school, and then a slightly smaller and flatter one in the afternoon. And if your roadway capacity is there at that line, we spend all of our energy in transportation focused on the peak 15 minutes of the peak 1 hour. That is our focus for a level of service equation. And so if you hit level service F, or in many cases, level service D or E, that is a complete disaster and requires radical rethinking of the transportation infrastructure, while ignoring, again, that the vast majority of roadway and all transportation system capacity is effectively waste. Now, if Southwest Airlines were managing its service according to this model, they would very quickly go bankrupt. But because, again, in transportation, we pretend that the market doesn't matter, we focus on the peak 15 minutes of the peak 1 hour. And part of the reason for that is our system of metrics. So all of you have heard of level of service. It's an A through F letter grade system that measures the seconds of delay. Well, it actually doesn't even measure. It's an estimate of the average system, the average seconds of delay that are a result of congestion for the peak 1 hour of the day as measured off of the peak 15 minutes. So it measures seconds of delay for cars, not for example, for people. And it only measures seconds of delay associated with congestion, not with, say, signal timing. And about every 10 to 15 seconds of additional delay results in a higher or worse letter grade. With the implication being that level service F is complete failure, that your intersection has failed, and you, as the municipal traffic engineer, are now a personal failure for having failed your intersection and failed your community. So level service F, terrible. Now the implication of this is as well that level service A, where there's no delay associated with congestion, nobody driving in front of you, this is the best that we could possibly do as transportation professionals. Wild success. Look at that. You could drive as fast as you want. This is the best that we could do. Now, never mind that this is a horrible street to walk down as a pedestrian, and it's dragging down the property values adjacent to it. That doesn't matter. What really matters is that there's nobody driving in front of you. This is a street called University Avenue in Palo Alto. It varies sometimes. It's one of the highest grossing retail shopping streets in the United States. It is at level of service F kind of all day long. The street used to have 4 lanes. The city took away 2 of those lanes. Everyone complains about traffic congestion, but no one would ever put those 2 lanes back, even though it would improve level of service. Why? Because the city of Palo Alto knows that the primary function of University Avenue is not seconds of delay for cars, but retail sales per square foot. That is their transportation performance metric. Retail sales per square foot is the only thing that matters on a street like University Avenue. They couldn't care less. Well, they whine and whine and whine about level of service, but they're not going to do anything to change it. Their street is perfect as it is. And even multimodal level of service criteria, if you use certain ways of measuring level of service for pedestrians, the only thing that pedestrians want is to be able to walk as fast as they can, unimpeded by other pedestrians, right? So the empty sidewalk with tumbleweeds blowing across it and boarded up storefronts, yeah, that's great level of service for pedestrians, but a successful retail street, no, you certainly don't want that, because how am I going to get through that crowd of people? That's awful. So the moral of the story is that what's important in transportation depends upon your perspective. If you're a traffic engineer, University Avenue is terrible, this street, which will not be named, is great. But if you're an economist, you would say that in fact, at level service F, if you've designed the transportation facility so that demand equals supply in the peak 1 hour, you have sized that transportation facility perfectly. That's the right size for the transportation facility. If you'd made it bigger, you would have wasted public resources. You would have made the street more difficult to walk across. You would have dragged down property values. And indeed, for demand to equal supply, which means level of service F, you have designed the perfect roadway. But there are other things that we should consider when we're looking at transportation performance metrics. Again, transportation is simply an investment strategy for helping your community achieve its larger goals. If your goals are not reflected and quantified in your transportation performance metrics, your transportation system will not meet your community's needs. If your community cares about public health, you could have health goals. If your community cares about social equity or ecological sustainability or retail sales per square foot or safety, all of these things can be built into your metrics. You can do before and after studies, you can do predictive studies, and more importantly, rather than having different interest groups yelling at each other and whoever yells the loudest wins and your poor traffic engineer is left wondering, what the hell am I supposed to do with all of this? You could actually provide clear guidance to your municipal engineer about the degree to which any one mode might be inconvenienced in order to benefit the others, and the degree to which economic development on your main street is more important than, regional through traffic or seconds delay for cars. So lots of examples around the country. One example from California. About a year ago, the state of California passed legislation, Senate Bill 743, that is actually going to make use of level of service illegal under the California Environmental Quality Act for traffic analyses for findings of environmental significance. In part because what California found is that endlessly chasing after an unachievable level of service C or D goal was actually creating the very problem that it was intended to solve. So you do a development impact analysis, right? You're required in all states to look at the worst case scenario level of traffic generation because we need to be conservative in our analysis, right? You don't want to, people like their cars. So why don't we be conservative and estimate a high number of vehicle trips? So we then take that high number of vehicle trips, dump it into the traffic model, add some background growth, also to be conservative, and then look at level of service for each intersection, and then we're required to develop a mitigation strategy if there's a level of service exceedance. If an intersection goes from D to E or E to F, we need to bring it back to C or D or whatever the local requirement is. So the problem is we've overestimated vehicle trip generation, and now we've got a limited number of responses to mitigate the problem. You can shrink the project so that it just goes under the threshold, so that you stay at level service D. You can move the project to a more isolated location, move it to the edge of town where there's not current traffic congestion. Because of course it's fine to bring the intersection from A to D. That's not a problem. But D to E, that requires mitigation. So moving the project farther away is always better under level of service. Or more importantly, you can simply widen the intersection in order to accommodate this excessive amount of traffic. The problem with widening the intersection is that it triggers a couple of responses. One, it makes it that much more difficult to walk or bike or take transit. You now have 2 more traffic lanes to cross as a pedestrian. You've now increased the vehicle trip generation rate for the entire community because people who were walking and biking and taking transit are now no longer doing that. They are driving. More importantly, you unlock the law of induced demand. So you've just made it easier to drive, and now more people will drive. We'll get to that in a second, which requires using the right tools for measuring your transportation performance metrics. It's important to recognize that travel demand models, while they're great tools, they are no better than tarot cards at predicting the future, right? What travel demand models allow us to do is to compare alternatives against each other, provided we understand the assumptions that are built into the model and what the model was designed to test. Models are not all-knowing and all-powerful. We work really hard to put them in a black box so that you can't understand them, but they're actually not all that complicated. And one of the things that models notoriously underestimate is what we call induced demand. So none of us likes sitting in traffic congestion. It's incredibly annoying. Those brain chemicals get fired in our head. We don't like that. And so we complain and we demand that the city or the state widen the roadway. So money is raised, a lot of money is spent, the road gets widened, and now we're happy, right? Because we can drive faster again. This is great. Unfortunately, things don't stop there. Because we can drive faster, we can now drive other places. So, oh, that restaurant that opened across town, why don't we go try it? Because now we can get there fast. Before there was too much congestion. Or, better yet, honey, why don't we go and move to that bigger, cheaper house farther away? Because we can now commute to work faster that they've widened the highway. So, of course, faster driving, at least in a vibrant economy, results in more driving, which results in congestion, which makes us sad, which makes us demand that the roadway get widened, which, helps for about 5 minutes, and then more people drive, and then, yeah. So, it is amazing to me that throughout the United States, and I still have to deal with this in my work all the time, there is still this pervasive belief that, yes, we know that, those previous 6 travel lanes that we added, those didn't solve the problem, but we know, because the model says so, we know that adding just one more lane will finally solve our congestion problem. It doesn't. And it doesn't because transportation is an economic system. It does it because there are unintended consequences of our actions. And more importantly, our travel demand models are always based on the assumption that our past trends will continue forward infinitely into the future. So I oftentimes think of cities like small businesses. So I have a small business, and if I were to run my business based upon only what I wanted, I would quickly fail. Now, if I were to run my business based upon what my current clients want, I could probably do a pretty good job. But if I want to be really successful and crush my competition, what I need to know is what my future customers want. That is who I need to pay attention to. And this is even more true in cities. If you want your city to be successful, manage your city for its current customers, but plan your city for its future customers. If you want to know what the next capital investment should be in your town, do not ask yourself or your neighbors. Ask your children or your grandchildren. Go and track down the 16-year-old girls in your community and ask them what they want, because they are your design customer and the only people you should be paying attention to. And lo and behold, there are radically different attitudes about transportation and mobility by generation. My generation was the very last generation to have actually believed it when the automobile television commercials told us that owning our own car would bring us freedom, autonomy, social status, and sex. There is something that brings people all of those items today, and that's one of these, right? And the car is the only thing that takes me away from this. And so, while yes, young people are absolutely driving today, their attitude about mobility is radically different. No longer is the car an extension of personal identity, it is just a tool. And if it's the only practical tool to be used, yes, young people will do it and they'll resent it and they'll be texting while they do it and crash, but that's not your responsibility. If young people are given alternative, they will take it in droves. And the attitudinal surveys of millennials bear this out. I won't go into the data. Point number 4 is to reward the private sector for doing the right thing. Right now, for the most part, we are regulating the wrong stuff. We use our primary land use controls to basically limit density as a proxy for dealing with community character and for managing traffic. Limiting density, controlling floor area ratio, is a really stupid tool for trying to create better community character or for managing traffic. There are brilliant people in the room here who know exactly how to regulate for community character, and what I will tell you is the last thing that you should be doing in order to manage traffic congestion is reducing density. What you need to do in order to regulate traffic congestion is to regulate traffic congestion. Manage congestion and vehicle trip generation directly rather than indirectly through regulating density. And so employers in Silicon Valley, Genentech is an interesting example. South of San Francisco, very isolated suburban office park, no public transportation, nothing to walk to. They were having a successful run, wanted to expand, and had to expand onto their surface parking lots and realized just how expensive it was to build new parking structures to accommodate their employees who had been parking for free. And so they looked at the cost very carefully, and we helped to convince them that, in fact, rather than spending tens of millions of dollars building new parking structures, why not take that money and invest it directly into their employees, to pay your employees not to drive, rather than build them parking that was just going to make your campus more horrible and more expensive. And so indeed, that is what they did. $5 a day to not drive, along with a rich array of investments, basically inventing their own public transportation system because the county wasn't serving them, investing in bike sharing and other programs, not because they were good corporate citizens, but purely out of a business case. It was cheaper for them to invest in paying their employees not to drive and providing them with bike and transit and walking alternatives than it was to build parking. But the only way that this actually worked was to negotiate with the city of South San Francisco to do two things. One, get them out of their completely counterproductive minimum parking requirements. You know, if Genentech had to meet its minimum parking requirements, it would have just ended up with very expensive empty parking structures. More importantly, they needed to renegotiate how traffic analysis was done, allowing Genentech to basically grow as much as it wanted, provided it kept its peak period motor vehicle trip generation capped. This was a very, very good deal for Genentech, for the city, and particularly for the Bay Area, because finally, the interests of this private corporation and the interests of the public good were in alignment because the city got its counterproductive regulations out of the way. The result has been extraordinary. Genentech has gone from a 75% drive-alone rate down to a 55% drive-alone rate in a place, again, where there's no public transportation or anything to walk to. And their greenhouse gas emissions reductions have been extraordinary. On several steps further, Mountain View has basically gotten out of the business of regulating density and said to developers, basically, y'all do whatever you want, but for this entire office park area, we are capping peak period motor vehicle trip generation at 2015 levels. You want to build, but you're bringing your vehicle trip generation down. In fact, anyone who wants to build has to bring their entire holdings auto mode share rate below 45% in a location, again, where there is no public transportation and nothing to walk to. And within 60 days of this plan being adopted with these incredibly stringent requirements, more stringent than we know of has ever been developed anywhere in the world, everyone was telling us that no developer would ever agree to build under these conditions, a 45% drive-alone rate cap in the suburb. Within 60 days of the plan being approved, the city had development applications for 7 million square feet of growth because it allowed the developers to figure out, to have the freedom to grow by monetizing vehicle trip generation reduction, by trading trip reduction for additional development entitlement. Win, 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 win deal for the city, the employers, and the developers. And in fact, LinkedIn, who has their headquarters in this place, just this week said that they are going to achieve a 35% drive-alone rate in a place with no public transportation because it will allow them additional development entitlement, and it is worth it, and they can pay their employees not to drive through the savings of not having to acquire new land. Point number 5, and this is a fundamental rule: never, ever compromise the quality of the pedestrian experience in order to better accommodate any mode of transportation. Not only do we need to put the needs of daily life within walking distance, but we need to make sure that the quality of that walk experience is unrelentingly delightful. Unrelentingly delightful. And this is necessary not just for making, walking nice. It is a fundamental prerequisite for transit success. If you can't walk to and from the bus stop, the bus system isn't going to work. It is also, interestingly, fundamentally important for the success of the driving system. If you want your downtown to work, you need to get people to park once, oftentimes a block or two away, and you need to get them to walk to 2 or 3 or 4 different destinations. And if your walk experience isn't good, your driving system also will not work. Also, this is Santa Monica, California, where people drive from hundreds of miles around just for the privilege of being able to walk in a nice place in Los Angeles County. And in fact, in Santa Monica, downtown Santa Monica, California, again, one of the most wildly successful retail destinations in the country, in Los Angeles, where everyone drives, and trust me, they do, I'm from there. Peak cumulative parking demand for downtown Santa Monica in a region where you would expect between 5 and 14 spaces per 1,000 square feet. Peak cumulative parking demand in downtown Santa Monica, anyone want to guess? Spaces per 1,000.
0.5.
Oh, yeah, it's not quite 0.5, it's 0.82. And not because everyone's taking transit, it's because people are driving, but they're parking once and they are doing 6 things. Or in other words, Santa Monica is getting 6 times the economic power per vehicle trip as its neighbors that have strip malls as their retail centers. Point 6, and this is fundamental for any of you who are economic development specialists, is make cycling safe and pleasant for people of all ages. If you want to make your city attractive to talented young people who have a choice of where to go, some of the most cost-effective investments that you can make are investing in your bike system, and not just for 30-year-old white guys in Lycra, but for this kid and for the 60-year-old woman with 2 sacks of groceries on her bike. Phenomenally cost-effective investment, and in fact, a necessary investment for the future of our communities. What this means is not doing what we do in the United States, which is to focus on this portion of the market. This is the white guys in Lycra. Or more progressive communities like focus on people like me who feel reasonably comfortable driving, my bike in a bike lane in the street. No, we are not relevant. If you want to make it, you've got to focus on that 60 to 80% of Americans who own a bike, who really want to bike more, but don't feel comfortable biking on your streets. Phenomenal amount of data about shopping behavior by cyclists as well. In fact, on almost every street that we've looked at, even ones where they've removed parking in order to put in a high-quality bike facility, retail sales go up in part because very easy to park a bike. But bikes also travel at a speed which they can see into storefront windows. Biking is phenomenally valuable for facilitating local retail sales, particularly in a Main Street format. Data everywhere. This data happens to be from New York. These amazing increases in retail sales for the New York City Protected Bikeway Program, 49% increases in sales. Who wouldn't want that? Point 7. Pay attention to what Jarrett Walker told you yesterday. Transit is more important than ever, particularly as our economy is changing and market preferences are changing. And in addition to good thinking about transit structure and network design and the importance of investing in it in communities, we also need to make sure that it is unrelentingly high quality, that we invest in the right level of dignity. So this is a tram in France, and you'll notice a couple things. Floor to ceiling, completely transparent glass. No advertising. If you're sitting on this tram, you can look outside. You can have a flirtation. If you're standing outside this tram, you could look all the way through the tram to the other side of the street and see the store sign. When you're on this tram, you are a part of the urban experience. This is not just about mobility. This is about urban branding. The economic return on investments like these are extraordinary for the city, even if they are not for the transit agency. And so in the future, transit will be successful to the extent that it can partner with those who can benefit from the value increase of the right level of transit investment. So transit partnerships with the private sector and municipalities, people who benefit from transit, are necessary. And this is not necessary only because transit is good or green. This has very little to do with ideology and everything to do with geometry. We can move more than 10 times as many people per square foot of roadway on public transportation than we can in a car. And even if we have driverless cars, the geometry of driverless cars improves things, but not nearly to the extent that the geometry of public transportation works, particularly if we have driverless public transportation. But that is a whole other lecture. So the magic of urban places, particularly medium to high density urban places, does not work if that travel is by automobile, because the automobile takes up too much space. In other words, I love driving my car, but I also need to recognize that every time I drive my car, I displace 10 other users of the roadway. And if you want more people to come shop in your downtown, do not displace them by forcing people to drive. Now, in order for all this to work, you need to adopt the right street design manual. Peter Swift talked a little bit about this yesterday. This is becoming increasingly easy to do thanks to the National Association of City Transportation Officials. They have their urban street design guide, bikeway design guide. They're coming out with a transit facilities design guide. I don't need to say anything more other than get rid of your old highway-oriented street design manual, which is perfectly appropriate for rural highways. And instead adopt an urban street design guide for your urban streets. The techniques that make rural highways safe and functional are the opposite of the techniques that make urban streets safe and functional. They require a very different design approach. And you need to make sure that that design approach is required, not something that designers have to go through an onerous exceptions process for. Very importantly, and you heard all about this yesterday, be smart about parking, read Don Shoup's book, and then we can come talk about working through the details. Critically important to get your parking right. But finally, and the final point that I would really like to leave you with, goes back to this, the Futurama exhibit, really. So we've been taught since the 1930s that the city of the future is always going to be about unconstrained, unlimited mobility. And whether it's the Futurama exhibit and everyone owning a car, or the Jetsons and people sort of jetting around in their flying car, transportation technology has been driving our vision of the city of the future for almost 100 years. And in fact, our vision of the city of the future is effectively unchanged since the 1930s. We're stuck with this antiquated vision of what our cities should be. I would argue that the real vision for the city of the future starts not with transportation technology, but with the fundamental constants of the needs of the human body and the human mind. Our physical bodies need 10,000 steps every single day in order to function optimally. If you are not designing your cities so that those 10,000 steps happen as a natural course of everyday life, you are designing a sick city. Our social primate brains need crave a minimal amount of social interaction. And if you're designing your cities so that social interaction happens inside exclusive clubs or on the internet and not on Main Street or on front porches, you're designing basically a mentally ill city. I would also argue that there is nothing that the human brain tires of, or rather, that the human brain tires of everything except for one thing, and that is beauty. Again, this goes back to our brain chemistry. How many of you, how many hundreds of sunsets have all of you seen? And yet, every time we see a sunset, it's as if we're seeing it for the very first time. We are gobsmacked, right? They're phenomenal. Our brains are hardwired to crave a particular kind of beauty. And not only does this beauty make us happy, but it also makes us attached. We love and we maintain things that are beautiful. If they're not beautiful, they can be throwaway objects. And I would argue that there is nothing more sustainable in our cities than maintaining what we already have. No LEED Platinum building that is brand new is going to have the same ecological performance as a very well-maintained existing building that has lived for generations. So if there is one rule that I can leave you with, it's that beauty needs to be a fundamental component of not only how we design cities, but also how we design our transportation systems and the experience that everyday people enjoy on those transportation systems. And that's been a long lecture. If you want more detail, read my book, and we may have time for questions, probably not.
We don't have time, but we're going to make the time.
All right.
So that's another great presentation. We got all sorts of hands. You're the first one here.
Thanks. You mentioned that there's good data out there on the shopping behavior of cyclists. Could you direct us towards a couple of those sources?
So most of the data is coming from individual municipalities that have collected before and after data when they've installed bike facilities. New York City, obviously kind of an extreme example, not relevant to a lot of cities, but the model that New York developed in terms of their data collection protocols, useful for everyone. There's a publication called Measuring the Street, which I would encourage all of you to look at and to think about adapting for your own cities. Salt Lake City, just last week, released their new data for shopping behavior. They ripped out a bunch of parking on Broadway, installed a separated bikeway, collected the retail data there. San Francisco has very good data for Valencia Street and a couple of the other streets. Now I'm spacing on, I can send you more. I'm forgetting the other examples off the top of my head. But actually, the website, the Green Bike Lane Project, or People for Bikes, has compiled a lot of that research.
All right, we've got a question over here.
Yeah.
Hey, Jeff, and thanks very much for the shout out. I have a reaction that I have a lot when I'm watching these sort of presentations, which is I totally agree with everything you say, and I totally agree that the fundamental appeal to beauty that you're making is something that almost every human being is capable of reacting to. And when I see images that I know are meant to please me as a fundamentally middle-class American, I wonder, I think about the way that less fortunate people are responding to these images, and the way that, having listened to a lot of them, the way many of them feel excluded by these images because they see them as not something that could ever happen for their communities.
Yep.
So how do we tie this whole message into the whole agenda of social inclusion?
Yeah, that is an outstanding question. In fact, some of the images that I use, I try to tailor them to the audience because all of these images, they're designed to provoke an emotional response, but what your perspective is creates very different emotional responses, particularly if you feel excluded from the possibility of attaining whatever is in the picture. our appreciation of beauty is universal. And in fact, as Bob Gibbs pointed out earlier, beauty doesn't need to be expensive. You know, the sidewalks on Rodeo Drive are just plain concrete. Oftentimes, beauty is really just about getting the details right, and in fact, aligning yourself with the natural world, which we instinctively find beautiful. I think there's been some fantastic work done in several communities around the United States. I think in East Los Angeles and the Barrio neighborhood of San Diego, of really working closely with traditionally disadvantaged communities on this topic of beauty and tailoring it to the local, not only economic context, but particularly the social context and ethnic context as well. So in all of our work, we need to make sure, again, that we know who our audience is. Don't try to impose your own views on the community that you're working in, but act as a facilitator and find out what are the values and perspectives of the folks that you're working with. Paying particularly careful attention, again, to not just the current consumers, but those future consumers. Because these investments that we're making, if we make them right, they need to last for 50 years. So if we're just planning for today's market and not thinking about the market of the future, we're not making a wise investment. And that means paying careful attention to what those folks are in fact looking for and what they're going to emotionally resonate with.
Great presentation, Jeffrey. So as you know, I was a transit planner for Santa Monica for like 15 years. And I think it's very important to clarify that the 0.8 parking ratio in Santa Monica is possible in large part because 15% of all trips to downtown Santa Monica are by transit. That's a bus-only system. And if you look at restaurants, we talked a lot about restaurants, over 70% of restaurant employees actually get to work by bus to Santa Monica, traveling long distances. And what I'm finding in Lafayette, where I'm doing the first ever in-depth study of the transit system for the MPO, is that the journey to work is the number one reason why people are riding the bus in Lafayette, as it is in everywhere else. But that's been a surprise for people in Lafayette. And they're going to work at fast food and big box jobs more than anything else.
Yep, you're absolutely right.
Hi, I'm Eleanor Bowie. I was used to. We could go anywhere, anytime.
Can you speak in a little closer?
As small children, even we were. Pardon me. Okay. I now live in a much smaller community. So, I mean, I never had any bias against using, public transportation or walking the streetcar. I brought it from my school to my daddy's office. It was lovely. Now I'm in a smaller community, and I would like to be able to do those things. And as I'm thinking and looking around this room, most of us in here are baby boomers. We're between, low end of 50s, high end 70s. My ability to jump on a bike anymore and go get groceries is like zero. So you got this huge population in America, the biggest population group ever, that is aging. Well, where is our group going to be with this?
Well, so your group, which is, of course, the largest demographic sector and the sector that is most likely to vote, needs to find your power and to understand the influence that you have over, most importantly, transportation performance metrics, right? You need to change the rules of the game for how transportation systems are analyzed, and particularly the funding formulas that tell us which projects, where we invest our billions. I would argue that the billions that we're spending right now aren't really thinking about you, particularly where you and your compatriots are going to be 5 to 10 years from now. So if we look at other communities, they are recognizing that it is not just middle-aged white men that matter, right? In fact, the primary design orientation, for example, of the National German Street Design Manual is, in fact, a 65-year-old woman and an 8-year-old child, right? Those are the primary design vehicles for the Street Design Manual. It starts there, and the cars get whatever is left over. This is a complete opposite of the approach that we take in the United States, where it says the first thing that we pay attention to is the cars, and then the sidewalk is basically weed control along the side of the roadway, right? So really understanding the money situation and what exactly it is that your generation is going to need, and make sure those needs are being met, that is the only thing that is going to actually change the situation that we found ourselves in now.
Yes. I'd like to just point out something which is relatively remarkable. One is the way that traffic engineers and retail consultants and all sorts of specialists, when they're new urbanists, become generalists. What actually defines us is not so much that we know about walking, or that, and that we privilege it, because everybody does that now. It's the fact that what Jeffrey did and what Bob Gibbs did is they presented as generalists. They spoke about beauty, they spoke about traffic, they spoke about all sorts of complex issues. And that's what defines the beautiful presentation of Jeffrey. Unfortunately, you still need a professional. Like Jeffrey has to make that presentation, it can't be you. It has to be a first-rate traffic engineer. Bob Gibbs has to make the presentation, it can't really be you, it has to be somebody with incredible credentials. But it's that combination of the generalist. Now, I was going to say one thing that I also notice about the new urbanism as it emerges is taking on a lot of prejudices. For example, Bob had to spend a lot of time saying Walmart is a really useful department store, right? Because we're intrinsically against it. There is something in terms of transportation for older folk, which is absolutely in front of us, which is the golf cart. I visited the villages in Orlando where approximately 144,000 relatively happy people are being transported to all their daily needs in golf carts. And when you mention a golf cart to a new urbanist who should know better, they say, ew, no golf carts. That kind of thing I think is unacceptable. Whatever works has to be studied. Now, it could be that you're not so dignified in a golf cart, that you look kind of pathetic and a loser. In fact, you look like a white male, regardless of who you are. But we have to get over that and actually really pursue exactly what works. And I think that the answer, the fact that we even have to say, well, what am I going to do, means that we have actually taken golf carts completely off the table, because and that's pure prejudice. And so I would like to remind the crowd to really re-study, rethink what your prejudices are.
And to the golf cart technology, I would add the adult tricycle.
Oh, yes.
My mother could ride a bike for longer than she could walk. As her bones were deteriorating and as her knees started acting up, she couldn't really walk anymore, but she was great on a bike. And even after she was no longer stable on a two-wheeled bicycle, she could ride an adult tricycle and power herself, and it was extraordinarily good exercise for her. And when she could no longer ride the adult tricycle, she could ride an electric assist adult tricycle and basically take care of the needs of her daily life and not be dependent upon me, right, to be her chauffeur everywhere, right? So yes, making technology our servant and the servant of social goods, in addition to just being cool and nifty, is going to be increasingly important.
Jeff, one last question. You talked about the importance of planning for the next generation. So can you give us just some brief rules of thumb on the impact on trip generation of Uber and other car sharing, Zipcar, and driverless cars.
So that's a longer lecture.
That's in the afternoon.
Let me just, I'll try to go through this very quickly. So the subject of driverless cars is huge. So, I'm working in Google land. We see them all the time. They exist. There's no question that the era of humans driving cars is at its end. And 20 years from now, your grandchildren will look at you and say, Grandma, I heard back in the olden days that humans were actually allowed to drive cars. Is that true? And you'll say, well, yes, honey. And she'll say, well, didn't that mean 30 to 40,000 people a year died? And then you'll say, absolutely it did. And she'll just be baffled. Humans will not be driving cars, probably, well, certainly 20 years from now. The question is, how fast will the adoption rate be? And that's really about how fast government regulation and the market push rapid replacement of the existing fleet, right? My car is 20 years old. And it's going to take a lot to, pry my hands off the steering wheel. Regardless, they're coming. And they're going to change everything. Safety will be extraordinarily improved. My greatest concern, however, about the era of driverless cars is that the only brake today on the magic of induced demand is the fact that driving is so annoying. When you no longer have to pay attention to the road, when you can look at internet cat videos or, sit at your desk and work on your laptop or, do whatever it is you're going to be doing in your car, sleep, that time limitation is lifted. And the amount of induced demand that gets unleashed is going to be extraordinary. And so if you think that sprawl is bad now, why bother actually living in your home when you can in fact live in your vacation home 6 hours away and sleep on your commute and work on the return journey, right? Why bother having a home at all when you can sleep in your car and shower at the gym? So, nonetheless, other changes will happen as well. So we can also expect that individual auto ownership, except for car aficionados, basically goes away. That the only people who own cars are people who own boats today, or folks who really need a car and the same car every day because they've got their tools in their truck. Getting a car will mean, going on your phone, pushing, figuring out what kind of car you want for this trip, how much you want to pay, and it will come to you. Why would you actually own the damn thing? And so the result of this is every city in America has at least twice as much and likely 80% more parking today than it will ever need in the future. If you're having developers build more parking today, you are wasting an extraordinary amount of resource and you're destroying your community. There is absolutely no justification for minimum parking requirements today. There certainly will not be in the future. Really rethinking parking in order to be adaptable. If parking is going to be built, make sure that the floors are level and the floor-to-ceiling height is sufficient that it might be retrofitted into something else. If you're building parking structures at odd angles, you're building white elephants that are going to be outrageously expensive to remove when they're no longer needed and dragging down your community's property values. Other considerations, well, there's others, but that's, again, a much longer lecture.
Let me just say, I'm not as enthusiastic about the future, primarily just to start with from the legalistic perspective as an attorney. I can think of millions of reasons why it's going to be a slow transition, except for, we can see this technology being advantageous in certain conditions, but not ubiquitous. So we can talk about that later.
That'll be a good argument at lunch.
Let's have a drink. One final question, then we're going to take a break.
Have y'all dealt with in communities varying the starting of work times? And I'll cite one example. I worked for the Air Force in Georgia at Robins Air Force Base. We had 36,000 employees, 30,000 of which came to work every morning and left every afternoon. And there were only two gates. 8 lanes, 2 gates. And they staggered the work time, 7:30, 8, and 8:30. And then you had 6 lanes in the morning and 6 lanes out in the afternoon. And there literally was never congestion. On the highway, you could get everybody in 20 to 25 minutes. You could, same way going out. And there was not a red light on this facility.
Yep.
It's just amazing traffic victory. And I wonder if communities haven't looked at this peak issue, altering the work times. And of course, with the government, we had full control of that. And in a free society, we may not.
So you ask an excellent question. So again, going back to this graph, this is the typical, traffic pattern in, many of our streets. And our focus is just on this little blip in time. So we don't even have to talk about mode shift, getting those people out of their cars and doing something else. All we need to do is flatten that out just a little bit. That's really, really easy to do, but only if the right incentives are in place. So this is a classic tragedy of the commons situation where, because of the, weird historical precedents and labor agreements and whatever, like, people need to start work at exactly 9 a.m. Without thinking through the consequences of those decisions. Not only is this an issue about work start time, but that AM peak is also largely driven not by work, but by school. Right? Our worst traffic problems are always, they're in the morning and not in the evening, because the overlap of the work and the school commute and the fact that the school commute is hyper concentrated, and it's actually forcing parents not only to drive their kid to school, but now even though the parent could have walked or biked or take transit to work, they can't do that because we've designed schools to not be accessible except by driving, right? So focusing on the school commute is oftentimes the most cost-effective way of solving that blip. Marin County, California, very affluent, horrible traffic congestion, invested in a safe routes to school program, just encouraging parents to form walking school buses, or wander through the neighborhood, gather up all the kids. Did a little bit of capital investment to make streets safer for walking and biking, mostly promotional stuff around getting kids to walk and bike safely. They were able to get a 25% reduction in traffic volumes in the morning peak just by focusing on the school commute. Really, really easy and cheap and phenomenal co-benefits in terms of better attentiveness at school, better grades. Getting your kids to walk or bike to school is effectively the equivalent of getting them to advance a full grade, right? Kids who walk and bike to school are much better at school, right? If you want to be a responsible parent, don't drive your kids to school unless you want them to perform more poorly at school. Get them some exercise.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeff. That was outstanding.